Good evening. Tonight our guest is His Grace, Mar Thomas, Dr. William Behun, Primate of the United States for the Apostolic Johannite Church and Professor of Philosophy at several universities. Good evening and glad to have you on the show, Your Grace.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Tonight our topic is the importance of critical thinking for Gnostics, and we thought that Dr. Behun, particularly with his philosophy background, would be a great person to talk about the importance of employing our critical faculties when approaching our religion as Gnostics. So I want to get right into this, Dr. Behun. Gnosticism is an experiential religion. We're expected to have a direct experience of the divine. So why is critical thinking still important for us?
I think that one of the things that sets Gnosticism apart from other forms of Christianity in particular, and religiosity general, is that it doesn't require us to take our brains off the hook, that we still can make use of those critical rational faculties even when we are trying to engage something that exceeds our normal sensory experience of the world, that goes beyond simple materialistic conceptions of the world. And I don't think that there's necessarily a conflict there between sort of reaching to and talking about supersensual realities and making use of our critical faculties.
Okay. So what happens, how can we use our critical faculties effectively when evaluating our spiritual experiences, when we're praying or meditating or we have some communion with the divine? How can we apply discernment? I think Monsignor Jordan Stratford has talked about the importance of discernment in Gnosticism. How can we apply our critical thinking faculties to evaluating these experiences?
I think that one of the most important things to consider in looking at that is that when we're talking about thinking critically and we're talking about deploying our judgment and our reason, we're not necessarily just talking about employing a sort of scientistic or materialistic conception. That there is, I think, especially on the part of certain enemies of religiosity, certain people, self-proclaimed militant atheists, people who really want to challenge religion as such. There's a tendency to think of any kind of that when we're talking about as thinking critically, and we're talking, and I think that that's the biggest mistake. And so, to be sure, if we're talking about the experience of prayer, if we're talking about the experiences that we have when we have mystical communion, those aren't things that we're going to be able to talk about scientifically necessarily. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we have to stop being critical. And I think what's important in those experiences is looking at the ways in which they shape our experience of the world. And often that involves certain practices like documenting, keeping journals and diaries, mm-hmm. Talking to others, sharing those experiences and evaluating them and asking real questions and saying, well, okay, what's happening here? I had this experience, and how do I think about this? Was this an experience of the divine? Was I, did I just go to bed hungry? I mean, these are reasonable questions, yeah. Right?
Sure.
So I think that what's most important in thinking critically about religious experience is just always to remember that any question that we can ask ourselves is going to be a good question. And so whenever we are saying, well, okay, let's think about this experience, let's not leap to conclusions, let's not assume that I've had this profound sort of transformative experience. Maybe it's something more subtle, maybe it's something a little more ordinary. Maybe it is just an insight, and not to be dismissive of sure. those things, not to be dismissive of any other kinds of experience, but not to assume that we, are St. Paul on the road to Damascus or something like that.
Would you think that the importance of critical evaluation might be proportional to the degree to which we want to apply our own personal experiences to others around us?
I think whenever we reach out to the outside world, and I mean that both in terms of our physical surroundings and also our social surroundings, we need to really deploy those critical faculties in a rigorous way. That whenever we're going to talk about the effects that our spiritual journey is going to have on the world outside of us, we need to be very, very careful not to, first of all, overstate those. And certainly I think that when we think about the failure to think critically about these sorts of experiences, I think we immediately think of things like claims to heal, claims to have profound effects on the outside world. And as soon as we make that step, as soon as we start making claims about the efficacy of what we do internally on the external world, that's where the critical thinking is most important. If I want to say, when I pray, I feel X, or when I perform this ritual practice, I get the sensation of such and such, that's unproblematic. But as soon as I say, well, I blessed this water, and when I gave it to this person who had cancer, her cancer went away. All of a sudden now we've got to really rigorously evaluate that claim. Can we provide evidence? Can we look at this in such a way that we could convince somebody who doesn't necessarily share our perspective or share our insights? And that, I think, is really the key to thinking critically, is when I'm talking about my own experiences, can I communicate those experiences in a meaningful way to other people such that they go, oh, yeah, okay, I can see how that could work? Or are they going to look at me and say, well, you're a whack job. You have no idea what you're talking about. You've clearly lost your mind. And so when I look at certain, especially healing practices, I'm always very, very suspicious. I'm always very, not because I don't think that those things are possible, but because we're talking about very material mechanisms. And as soon as we're talking about material mechanisms, I think we need to use a slightly different kind of language, and reason is at the forefront of that language.
Absolutely. What do you think? What do you have to say, Bishop Ken? You've been around for a long time. What do you think about the importance of critical thinking?
Well, I would like to say that, in many cases, and I'm sure, William may agree with this, is that, critical thinking is not necessarily a skill set that is taught to many students. Recent information has shown that even, many of the essays and things done by college students, that many of the teachers and professors look at and proclaim as well, this is a wonderful piece, is that when under very close analysis, critical thinking just wasn't present there. So I guess my question for William is, for our viewers and listeners who are not necessarily learned in the ideas of critical thinking, in a nutshell, how would you define, critical thinking? What is your definition?
Well, generally, when I think of critical thinking, what I'm thinking of is being rigorous and being precise in our own thinking and in our own evaluation of experiences. But when that takes a step to communicating that to somebody else, or building an argument to try to convince or persuade somebody else, the standard pitfalls, the standard fallacies, the standard informal logical problems that we see so often in the academy, that's really a great place to start. And you can look online, and all you need to do is type in logical fallacies, and you're going to get a dozen lists of standard informal fallacies. And familiarizing oneself with those, because they are easy traps to fall into, I think is one of the best things that we can do. And I think that that's really sort of what's at stake, is if we find ourselves talking to somebody and we're thinking, wow, this person isn't thinking critically, chances are that this is a person with the best of intentions who is not trying to pull something over on us, and they're not trying to be fraudulent, but they're just being sloppy in their thinking. They're falling into traps that are easy to fall into, and being aware of those is really the best way to avoid that in our own thinking.
Interesting. Interesting. Now critical thinking, though, I think is one as far as kind of our own determination, especially in Gnosis. Gnosis isn't just one thing. It isn't just critical thinking. Many things come into play with Gnosis. Some would say that Gnosis is part of that intuition process. Some would say that it is a combination of not only things that we've learned here, but things that are kind of come through the divine. How to kind of go back to our original question? How do we incorporate then the ideas of critical thinking with Gnosis and really kind of define our experiences as being not just purely subjective for ourselves?
Well, I think that hitting on that question of subjectivity is really the center. It's one thing for me to have an experience. It's another thing for me be able to communicate that experience to somebody else. And as soon as I'm trying to do that, I need to make sure that I'm deploying these critical resources and critical faculties. But I think that the best way to do that is to always be looking at and always questioning our own conclusions, and always saying, okay, does this meet a standard that I would want to see applied if I were talking to somebody else, and avoiding some of the easy kind of woo factor things that are so easy to fall into, as I said, of thinking that we are doing something more than what we're really doing. And I think that when we are talking about different kinds of experiences that really do extend beyond our ordinary everyday experiences of the world, and these are extraordinary experiences, I think that we have to take that seriously. At the same time, I don't think that it's necessary to overly mystify them, to talk about them in terms that make them out to be more than what they are. That often these experiences are things that can be communicated, and that other people will say, yeah, okay, I understand that. I've had those kinds of experiences as well. If we start to think about Gnosis as this transformative experience that turns me into the master of the cosmos and I have insight into being itself, all of a sudden we're trying to claim too much. And I think one of the biggest secrets to thinking critically is to make sure that you're not claiming more than you can
Sure.
really give evidence for.
Sure.
And ultimately, critical thinking, at least in the form that it takes when we're trying to convince somebody or we're arguing a point, is about evidence. And it's not about proof. I mean, that's an important distinction. It's not about proof. It's not about proving something to be true. It's about demonstrating that there's evidence to support the kinds of claims that we're making. And as long as there's solid evidence to support the things that we're saying, I think that we're on solid critical ground.
I think you bring up something there, is maybe the importance of, when we're communicating our experiences to others, the importance of being thoughtful and contemplating them. And just because something happens doesn't mean you have to go out and share right away, particularly if you don't really have a good way of communicating the information.
You can't give an account of it if you can't give an account of it. And so often, I mean, when we talk about experience in philosophical terms, a lot of times we're talking about giving an account. How do I give an account of what this experience is like? It's what, to use the technical term, what we're talking about in phenomenology, where we're looking at experiences and trying to say, okay, what exactly is that experience? What is it like to have that experience? And that takes a lot of reflection. That's not something that we can do very, very simply. And I know some of my colleagues have used projects in the classroom where you simply ask somebody to sit in a room and give an account of that room. And suddenly, as soon as you start to do that, you start to realize how much richness and how much depth and how much we're not noticing. But that only happens when you take that moment to step back and to think about it. And leap to conclusions, when we look for the most impressive or the easiest answer, then we're letting our own critical faculties slip. And as soon as we start to take our brains off the hook, as soon as we start to be driven by our desire for notoriety, or our need to convince somebody else, or our need to feel special, as soon as we're driven by those things, I think that there are red flags that should be going up all over the place for ourselves. And I think that, from my point of view, when I was asked to do this, I thought a lot about what I wanted to sort of focus on. And I think that the most important thing is not about criticizing somebody else and saying you're not using your critical faculties, but instead looking at ourselves and saying, when am I not using my critical faculties? When am I falling short? And if we do that, then at least we can hope that we don't sound like blithering idiots.
I think it's a real risk in a time of social media where you have an experience and you go onto Twitter or Facebook or Google Plus and you can just start vomiting. Yeah.
Social media, and I'm gonna speak just my own opinion here. Take it for what it's worth. Dismiss it if you will. I'm not speaking on behalf of any other person or any organization. But social media is not a good place to have these conversations.
Yeah.
It just isn't. Emotions run too high. It's too easy to get caught in glamour traps. It's too easy to try to compress what we're saying into too concise a form. There are just so many obstructions and so many obstacles to really having a reasoned conversation on social media, whether we're talking about Twitter, where you're restricted to 140 characters, or you're talking about Facebook, where everybody and their cat is going to weigh in on what you have to say, or you're talking about Google Plus, where you've got people from all kinds of different perspectives and communities that aren't necessarily qualified to speak on these subjects. You're just setting it up for a disaster. And the problem is, once that ball gets rolling, it just has a tendency to get out of control. I mean, we've all seen Facebook threads that explode in a matter of minutes because somebody makes some sort of claim. Yeah. And I think that avoiding those situations is one of the best ways to keep ourselves honest, right? To keep ourselves from engaging in those very negative behaviors. Because ultimately, the failure to think critically doesn't do anybody any good. It doesn't help you make a point. It doesn't help you win an argument. It doesn't help you spread your ideas. And one of the things that again that I love most about the AJC, and why I've found a spiritual home in the AJC, is because it never demands that we take something on faith in contradiction to our reason. Right. It never demands that we set our reason aside. It never demands that we turn our brains off, but instead always encourages us, no matter who's speaking or what the subject is, to think critically, to think rationally, and to think in a disciplined, rigorous way.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Mar Thomas, and we'll be talking to you, expanding on this topic in the podcast after the show. But we do need to wrap up the video portion of Talk Gnosis this evening. First of all, I want to thank everybody for joining us, and thank everybody who has been supporting us through Patreon. Patreon is a fundraising system that allows people to pledge even just a few pennies for each piece of content that we at Gnostic NYC put out each month. If you're interested in helping to support and spread the light of Gnosis, you can visit our Patreon page at Patreon, patreon.com Gnostic, and you can learn about the Patreon system there. And again, we thank you very much for your support, those of you who have supported us. Also want to remind everybody about the Johannite Conclave that's rapidly approaching at the end of May. This is the conclave, the annual meeting of the Apostolic Johannite Church, but everybody is welcome to come and attend. There are also day passes, special student discounts, and commuter discounts as well. So if you are interested in getting to know the Gnostic community a little bit more and attending some amazing classes and workshops by a wonderful array of speakers, please do check out the conclave information at the Johannite page, johannite.org.
Fantastic. Again, thank you, William, and we will be looking forward to seeing you and talking with you to continue this discussion on our podcast. Talk Gnosis After Dark is available on iTunes and Stitcher. You can also subscribe via the RSS feed. For more information or to give us any feedback, you can always shoot us an email at talkgnosis@gnosticnyc.com. You can always leave us comments on YouTube as well as on our Facebook page. Any other information, dear sister?
Well, I just wanted to thank everybody once again for joining us and remind everybody this has been a production of the Gnostic NYC Network. If you enjoyed this show, please share it with your friends, click the like button, and subscribe to our channel. Opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily represent the views of Gnostic NYC or any other organization. No animals were harmed during the production of this show. And for more Talk Gnosis, tune in every Wednesday night for new episodes. Thanks so much for joining us. Bye-bye.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.